January 27th, 2010. Boston, Massachusetts. Cars moved slowly along the highway beneath the cold gray sky. Morning traffic was heavy. People were heading to work. Coffee cups steamed inside vehicles. Nothing felt unusual. Then something fell from above. A dark shape crashed onto the pavement near the interstate beside Logan International Airport. Drivers slammed their brakes. Some thought it was debris from a plane. Others feared it was something far worse. Within minutes, police surrounded the area. What they found shocked everyone. It was a teenage boy. He wasn't carrying identification. There was no backpack, no clear answers, just a 16-year-old who had somehow fallen from the sky near one of the busiest airports in America. And the biggest question came immediately. How did he get up there? Investigators quickly noticed something disturbing. At almost the exact same moment, a commercial jet from North Carolina had been descending toward Boston Logan Airport overhead. The timing was impossible to ignore. Witnesses stared upward at the massive aircraft disappearing through the clouds. Nobody on board had reported a problem. The flight had looked completely normal from the outside. But hidden somewhere beneath that plane, investigators believed the teenager had spent the entire flight trapped inside the landing gear compartment, a place never meant for human survival. Temperatures there could drop far below freezing. Oxygen almost disappeared at high altitude. Even trained experts said surviving such conditions was nearly impossible. Yet somehow, this boy had made it all the way to Boston. At least for a while, news spread quickly across the country. Reporters gathered near the airport. Aviation experts tried to explain what could have happened. But one mystery remained larger than all the others. Who was he? But this true survival story didn't start here. January 23, 2010, Richmond, Virginia. Several days earlier, 16-year-old Delvonte Tisdale quietly disappeared from the group home where he had been staying. At first, nobody imagined the journey he was about to take, and nobody yet understood how far Delvonte had traveled or what he had been running from. January 23, 2010, Richmond, Virginia. 4 days before the shocking discovery near Boston, Delvonte Tisdale was still in Virginia, alive. Walking through the cold streets like any other teenager, trying to disappear into the background. But people around him knew something wasn't right. Delvonte had spent much of his childhood moving through foster homes, temporary care programs, and group facilities. Stability rarely lasted long. Adults came and went. Places changed. Rules changed. And over time, he learned not to expect permanence from anyone. By 16, he carried far more emotional weight than most teenagers his age. People who knew him described him as quiet and respectful, sometimes withdrawn, sometimes distant. He wasn't known for violence or serious trouble, but like many teenagers dealing with instability, he often struggled emotionally beneath the surface. And during those last days in Virginia, something inside him seemed heavier than usual. Staff members at the group home later noticed he had become quieter, more distracted. He kept to himself for long stretches. No dramatic breakdown, no loud warning signs, just small changes that became important only after he vanished. Then one day, he was gone. No phone call, no message, no clear destination. At first, disappearance didn't create immediate panic. Teenagers in unstable situations sometimes ran away temporarily before returning. Authorities believed Delvonte might simply reappear within a few days. But this time was different. Hours turned into an entire night, then another. Winter temperatures dropped across the East Coast. Delvonte had very little money, no known travel plans, and no confirmed place to stay. Still, there were almost no clues. Investigators later tried to piece together his movements after leaving Richmond. Some evidence suggested he traveled south through multiple cities, possibly by bus, possibly by rides from strangers. Much of the exact timeline remains uncertain even today. But one thing became painfully clear later. Delvonte was moving farther and farther away from home. At some point during those missing days, he likely arrived in Charlotte, North Carolina, nearly 300 miles from Richmond. Why Charlotte? Nobody knows for certain. Some investigators believed he may have been searching for escape. Others wondered if he hoped to reach someone he knew. But Delvonte never left behind answers. Only fragments. Security cameras from that time were limited compared to today. Tracking his movements became incredibly difficult. Every hour that passed left investigators with fewer details and more questions. Meanwhile, airplanes continued taking off above Charlotte Douglas International Airport day and night. Huge aircraft climbing into the winter sky. Most people never think about what exists beneath those planes, the hidden compartments, the freezing darkness, the deadly machinery. But somewhere near that airport, Delvonte was unknowingly getting closer to one of the most dangerous places a human being could ever hide. And somewhere beyond Virginia, Delvonte was already moving towards something dangerous. January 25th, 2010, Charlotte, North Carolina. By the time Delvonte Tisdale reached Charlotte, investigators believe he had already spent days moving from place to place with almost no stability. Winter air covered the city. Traffic moved endlessly around highways and airport roads. And somewhere in that unfamiliar environment, a 16-year-old was alone, hungry, tired, and mostly invisible to everyone around him. Charlotte Douglas International Airport was one of the busiest airports in the country. Thousands of passengers passed through every day. Planes arrived and departed almost non-stop. Engines thundered across the runways from early morning until late at night. For most people, airports are controlled spaces, secure, watched, protected. But large airports also cover enormous areas. Fences stretch for miles. Service roads cut through isolated sections. In 2010, security around outer perimeter areas was not as advanced as it would later become. Investigators eventually believed Delvonte somehow reached one of those restricted outer sections near the airfield. Exactly how remains uncertain. No clear footage ever showed him entering. No witness stepped forward saying they saw him climb a fence. But based on flight evidence and timing, authorities later concluded he most likely accessed the runway area from outside airport security alone. At night, the environment around an active runway is overwhelming even for trained workers. Massive jet engines shake the ground. Blinding lights flash across the pavement. Wind blasts through the air as aircraft move past, and yet Delvonte may have stayed there for hours without being noticed. Experts later explain that people attempting to hide near aircraft sometimes wait until the final moments before departure. During busy nighttime operations, ground crews focus on fueling, cargo, and mechanical checks. In darkness and noise, a hidden person can become dangerously easy to miss, especially near the landing gear. The wheel wells beneath commercial planes are large enough to hold the aircraft's massive tires during flight. But once the landing gear retracts after takeoff, the compartment becomes deadly. Crushing machinery folds inward. Temperatures collapse far below freezing. Oxygen nearly disappears. Most people lose consciousness within minutes. Many never survive at all. But Delvonte likely didn't fully understand any of that. Investigators believe he somehow climbed into the landing gear compartment of a U.S. Airways flight preparing to depart Charlotte for Boston, Flight 1174. More than 100 passengers boarded the aircraft that night. Families, workers, travelers heading home. None of them knew a teenager was hidden beneath their feet. Then the aircraft pushed back from the gate. Runway lights stretched into the darkness ahead. The engines grew louder. And somewhere inside the freezing metal compartment below the cabin, Delvonte held on as the plane accelerated down the runway. And once the plane left the runway, there was no turning back. The moment the aircraft lifted off the runway, the environment around Delvonte changed violently. The roar of the engines became deafening. Wind ripped through the small compartment as the plane climbed higher into the night sky. Within seconds, the landing gear began folding inward beneath him. This was the most dangerous moment. Inside the wheel well, giant mechanical parts moved with crushing force. Hydraulic systems pulled the landing gear back into place. There was almost no room for a human body. Investigators later believed Delvonte somehow avoided being crushed as the compartment closed around him. But surviving that first moment was only the beginning. As the plane climbed above the clouds, temperatures dropped rapidly. At cruising altitude, conditions inside a landing gear compartment can fall below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. The metal walls freeze, moisture turns to ice. Breathing becomes harder with every minute. And then comes the oxygen loss. At around 30,000 feet, the human body begins shutting down quickly with pressurized air. Oxygen levels become dangerously low. The brain struggles to function. Vision fades. Muscles weaken. Experts later said Delvonte likely lost consciousness early in the flight. That may have been the only reason his body survived as long as it did. A conscious person trapped in those conditions would likely panic. They might move suddenly, they might lose their grip. But unconsciousness slows movement and reduces oxygen demand slightly, giving the body a small chance to endure extreme conditions for a limited time. Still, survival remained incredibly unlikely. Over the years, only a small number of people worldwide had ever survived flights inside aircraft wheel wells. Most cases ended in tragedy long before landing. Meanwhile, inside the cabin above him, passengers continued their flight normally. Flight attendants drinks. Passengers listened to music. Some people slept beneath soft cabin lights while the aircraft crossed the East Coast overnight. Nobody heard the teenager hidden below. Nobody knew he was fighting against freezing temperatures and near suffocation only a few feet beneath them. The contrast was haunting, warm air above, deadly cold below. Life continuing normally inside the cabin, while another life hung silently between survival and death underneath the aircraft. As the flight continued north toward Massachusetts, Delvonte's body likely entered survival shutdown. Hypothermia slows the body dramatically. Heart rate drops. Breathing weakens. The brain conserves energy however it can. In rare cases, extreme cold can temporarily preserve life longer than expected. But only for a short time. Hour after hour, the aircraft moved closer to Boston. Far below, cities passed beneath the clouds unnoticed. Roads. Homes, entire lives continuing normally. And hidden inside the darkness of the landing gear compartment, a 16-year-old remained suspended thousands of feet above the ground in one of the harshest environments imaginable. But the worst moment of the journey was still ahead. January 27, 2010. Approaching Boston, after nearly 2 hours in the air, U.S. Airways Flight 1174 finally began descending toward Logan International Airport. Inside the cabin, passengers prepared for landing. Seatbacks moved. Upright window shades opened. Some travelers looked down at the snowy Massachusetts coastline, appearing through the clouds below. Everything felt routine. But beneath the aircraft, something terrifying was beginning to happen. As commercial planes descend, the air slowly becomes thicker again. Oxygen levels rise. Temperatures increase slightly compared to the freezing conditions at cruising altitude. Investigators later believed this change may have caused Delvonte to partially regain consciousness. If that happened, his final moments would have been horrifying, disoriented, frozen, barely able to breathe, and trapped inside a cramped metal compartment, shaking violently as the aircraft lowered toward the city. Then came the landing gear deployment. Seconds before landing, massive hydraulic systems activated beneath the plane. The compartment doors opened into the rushing air. Mechanical parts began unfolding downward toward the runway position. For anyone inside the wheel well, This moment was extremely dangerous. There would have been almost nothing to hold on to. Witnesses on the ground later described seeing something fall from the sky near the highway beside the airport. At first, many couldn't understand what they were looking at. Some thought debris had dropped from the plane above them. Then traffic suddenly stopped. Drivers stepped out in shock. Police and emergency crews rushed toward the scene within minutes. Overhead, the passenger jet continued toward Logan Airport, completely unaware of what had just happened beneath it. The plane landed normally. Passengers exited with luggage in hand. Most would not learn until later that authorities believed a teenager had traveled hidden beneath their flight the entire way from North Carolina. Meanwhile, investigators near the highway worked desperately to understand the scene in front of them. The body showed signs of extreme cold exposure. There was no luggage, no identification. Only clues suggesting the teenager had fallen from an aircraft moments earlier. News spread rapidly through Boston. Then across the country, television stations interrupted broadcasts. Aviation experts appeared on news programs trying to explain how anyone could survive inside a landing gear compartment for that long. And one detail shocked investigators more than anything else. Delvonte had survived almost the entire flight. Experts later believed he may have remained alive until the final moments before the landing gear opened above Boston. For a brief period, against nearly impossible odds, his body had endured conditions that normally kill within minutes. But within minutes, the mystery would spread across the entire country. The investigation began immediately. Local police, airport authorities, federal agents, and aviation experts all worked together to answer the same impossible question. How did a teenager end up inside the landing gear compartment of a commercial airplane? At first, investigators had almost nothing. No identification, no witnesses who knew the boy, no missing persons report connected to Boston. But forensic teams quickly discovered clues pointing south. Clothing, physical evidence, and flight timing all suggested the teenager had fallen from the U.S. Airways flight, arriving from Charlotte, North Carolina. Attention immediately shifted to the airport there. Federal investigators began examining security records, runway activity, and maintenance reports from Charlotte Douglas International Airport. They searched for any sign that someone had accessed restricted areas before the flight departed. But the airport had thousands of moving parts every day. Ground crews, fuel trucks, cargo vehicles, passengers, service workers. Finding one unnoticed teenager in that environment after the fact became incredibly difficult. Then investigators finally identified the boy. He was 16-year-old Delvonte Tisdale from Virginia. The discovery changed the story completely. Now investigators were no longer looking at a random aviation mystery. They were looking at the final moments of a missing teenager who had traveled hundreds of miles before somehow reaching an active runway. Police in Virginia shared details about Delvonte's disappearance days earlier from a group home in Richmond. Witnesses and records suggested he may have traveled through multiple cities before arriving in Charlotte, but many gaps remained. Nobody could fully explain how he survived near the runway long enough to approach the aircraft unnoticed. Nobody knew exactly when he entered the wheel well, and nobody knew what he had been thinking during those final days. Investigators also began examining airport perimeter security more closely. Experts admitted that large airports can contain vulnerable outer areas, especially before newer surveillance systems and stronger fencing upgrades became common. The case exposed uncomfortable realities. A determined person could sometimes reach dangerous restricted zones without immediately being detected, especially at night, especially alone. Meanwhile, aviation specialists explained the horrifying conditions Delvonte experienced during the flight. Most wheel-well stowaways lose consciousness quickly, Due to hypoxia and freezing temperatures, survival rates are extremely low. That made Delvonte's case even more unusual. Experts believed his body may have entered a slowed survival state caused by extreme cold exposure. It was likely the only reason he survived as long as he did during the flight north. But emotionally, the investigation became larger than aviation science. Because underneath the headlines was still a teenager who disappeared quietly, a teenager who somehow traveled hundreds of miles alone, and a teenager whose suffering had remained mostly invisible until the entire country suddenly saw the tragic ending. But the deeper investigators looked into Delvonte's life, the sadder the story became. After investigators identified Delvonte Tisdale, attention slowly shifted away from the shocking aviation mystery and toward the person at the center of it. And what they found was a teenager who had spent much of his life searching for stability. Delvonte grew up moving between difficult environments: foster care, temporary homes, group facilities, different adults, different rules, different routines. Like many vulnerable teenagers, he experienced long periods where life felt uncertain. People who knew him later described someone polite and quiet, not dangerous, not violent, just emotionally tired. Some caregivers said he struggled with abandonment and trust. Others remembered a teenager who sometimes kept his feelings hidden rather than talking openly about them. Over time, that kind of emotional isolation can become dangerous in ways people do not always notice immediately, especially for young people who already feel disconnected. In the days after his death, family members and people from his past tried to understand what may have pushed him towards such a desperate path. But many answers never came. Delvonte never left behind a clear explanation, no detailed message, no final note explaining his decisions. Only questions. Investigators could reconstruct parts of his journey: the buses, the travel south, the airport, the aircraft. But they could never fully reconstruct what was happening inside his mind. That uncertainty haunted the case, because beneath the headlines about airplanes and survival was another reality that felt painfully familiar across America: vulnerable teenagers disappearing quietly without immediate attention. Many runaways are found safely within days. Others are not. Some drift through cities unnoticed. Some avoid shelters. Some stop trusting adults entirely. And many become invisible long before anyone realizes how serious the danger has become. Delvonte's story forced people to confront that reality, not because his death involved an airplane, but because so much of his suffering happened silently before that final flight ever began. The tragedy didn't start inside the landing gear compartment. It started much earlier, in years of instability, loneliness, and emotional exhaustion that few people fully understood while he was alive. As the media attention slowly faded, investigators eventually closed much of the case. The major questions about the flight had mostly been answered, but emotionally, the story never felt fully resolved, because people were left wondering whether anything could have changed Delvonte's path before he reached that airport fence. And in the end, the questions left behind became almost heavier than the tragedy itself. Years later, the story of Delvonte Tisdale still feels difficult to understand, not because investigators failed to explain the aviation side of the case, but because some mysteries cannot be solved with evidence alone. Authorities eventually concluded that Delvonte most likely entered the landing gear compartment of the U.S. Airways flight in Charlotte before it departed for Boston. The physical evidence, timing, and flight path all pointed to the same conclusion. But many smaller questions never received clear answers. How exactly did he reach the runway unnoticed? How long was he near the airport before boarding the aircraft? Did he understand the danger inside the wheel well? Or was he simply trying to escape somewhere far away without fully realizing what would happen once the plane climbed into the sky? Nobody can say for certain. And maybe that uncertainty is what makes the story so haunting even today. Because Delvonte was not a criminal mastermind. He was not trying to become part of an aviation mystery. He was a teenager carrying emotional pain most people around him never fully saw. For a short period of time, the entire country focused on the shocking image of a boy falling from the sky near Boston. News stations discussed airport security. Aviation experts explained wheel-well survival. Reporters chased the mystery from Virginia to North Carolina and finally to Massachusetts. But after the headlines faded, what remained was something much quieter. A story about isolation, about vulnerability, about how easily someone can disappear emotionally before they disappear physically. Today, Delvonte Tisdale's case is still remembered as one of the most disturbing stowaway incidents in modern American aviation history. Not because of spectacle, but because of the human tragedy hidden beneath it. A boy traveled hundreds of miles alone. He survived conditions that almost nobody survives. And in the end, the world only noticed him after the final moments of his journey. High above the clouds, hidden beneath a passenger plane, Delvonte Tisdale became part of one of the most haunting aviation mysteries in modern America.